Welcome to Dr. Harmony, where we dive deep into the most gripping stories of betrayal, hidden truths, and the ultimate lessons in human nature. Today's story is one for the ages, a tale of a man who was silenced, pushed aside, and treated as a relic of the past, only to reveal a secret that would leave an entire city breathless. If you've ever felt undervalued or underestimated by those you love most, this story is for you. Sit back and prepare yourselves because the walls of the Sterling mansion are about to crumble, and the truth is far more expensive than anyone ever imagined. The rain over Manhattan was relentless, a cold gray sheet that blurred the skyline of the world's most ambitious city. Inside the penthouse of the Sterling Tower, the atmosphere was even colder. Arthur Sterling, a man of 74 with silver hair and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires, sat quietly at the head of a mahogany table. Across from him sat his wife of 15 years, Eleanor. At 42, Eleanor was the picture of Upper East Side elegance, sharp, polished, and currently utterly ruthless. Beside her sat Julian, a young, ambitious lawyer who Eleanor had been spending far too much time with lately, and Arthur's two adult children from his first marriage, Beatrice and Victor. They weren't there for a family dinner. They were there for a deposition. Eleanor slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. Her voice was devoid of the warmth that had once captivated Arthur. She told him that the marriage was over, citing irreconcilable differences, but the subtext was loud and clear. He was too old, too slow, and a barrier to the lifestyle she wanted to lead with the fortune he had built. Beatrice and Victor nodded in agreement, their faces masks of cold indifference. They had already made a deal with Eleanor. If they helped her push Arthur out, she would ensure their trusts were liquidated early. To them, their father was no longer a man. He was an ATM that had stopped dispensing cash at the rate they desired. The demands were staggering. Eleanor wanted the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the art collection, and 60% of his remaining liquid assets. Because of a cleverly negotiated post-nuptial agreement Arthur had signed during a period of illness 3 years prior, a document he now realized had been a trap, she had the legal leverage to strip him bare. Julian, the lawyer, smirked as he leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. He told Arthur that considering his age and the complications of his recent health scares, it would be best for everyone if he simply signed the papers, took a small monthly stipend, and moved into a quiet assisted living facility in upstate New York. They wanted him gone, hidden away like an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. Arthur looked at his children. Beatrice was checking her reflection in a compact mirror, and Victor was busy texting, likely ordering a new sports car he couldn't yet afford. The betrayal stung more than the loss of the money. He had built the Sterling Group from a single warehouse in Brooklyn into a global logistics titan. He had given them everything, only for them to treat his life's work like a carcass to be picked clean by vultures. He picked up the fountain pen, his hand steady despite the heavy silence in the room. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the kids. He looked straight at Eleanor. He asked her if this was truly what she wanted. If 15 years of companionship meant so little that she would leave him with nothing but a suitcase and a few $1,000s in a savings account he'd kept separate. Eleanor didn't blink. She told him that she deserved to live her best years without being a glorified nurse to a man whose time had passed. The cruelty in her voice was the final nail in the coffin. Without a word of protest, Arthur signed the documents. Page after page, he initialed the divestment of his properties, the transfer of his shares, and the surrender of his legacy. Julian let out a small, triumphant chuckle. It was the easiest heist of his career. When the last page was signed, Arthur stood up. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a man who had just shed a very heavy skin. He told them he would be out of the penthouse by the end of the week. Victor made a comment about making sure he didn't accidentally pack any of the silverware. Arthur simply smiled, a small, enigmatic tilt of the lips that should have made them nervous, but they were too blinded by greed to notice. He walked to the coat rack, put on his worn trench coat, and picked up a single, weathered leather briefcase. He walked out of the penthouse without looking back, leaving behind the gold leaf and the marble for a world that thought he was finished. The news of the Sterling divorce hit the tabloids the next morning. "The fall of a titan!" the headlines screamed. Eleanor was seen at a gala 3 nights later, draped in diamonds that Arthur had bought her, laughing with Julian. The social circles of New York whispered about Arthur's demise. Word was he was staying in a cheap motel near the airport, a broken man waiting for the end. The final court hearing to formalize the decree and the transfer of the final assets, a formality required by New York law, was set for Friday morning at the Supreme Court building. Eleanor and the children planned to arrive in a motorcade, a victory lap to signify the official start of their new lives. They expected Arthur to arrive in a yellow cab, smelling of defeat. The days leading up to the final court hearing were a whirlwind of celebration for Eleanor, Beatrice, and Victor. They spent money they hadn't even officially touched yet, racking up credit card bills on designer couture and luxury travel bookings. Eleanor had already begun remodeling the penthouse, ordering the removal of Arthur's study to make room for a private yoga studio and a walk-in climate-controlled closet for her fur collection. In their eyes, Arthur was a ghost, a shadow of the past that had finally been exorcised from their bright, wealthy future. They didn't bother to check on him. They didn't care where he slept, or if he had enough to eat. To them, his white flag was absolute. On the morning of the hearing, the sky over the city was a piercing crystalline blue, a sharp contrast to the gray gloom of the previous week. Eleanor stepped out of the Sterling Tower, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. She wore a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her eyes shielded by oversized dark glasses. Julian was at her side, looking smug in a bespoke Italian suit. Behind them, Beatrice and Victor stepped into a separate limousine, laughing about how they would celebrate once the judge gave the final gavel strike. The convoy of black cars pulled away from the curb, heading toward the courthouse, with the predatory grace of sharks in shallow water. When they arrived at the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters had gathered. The Sterling downfall was the talk of the town, and the media was hungry for a glimpse of the fallen patriarch. Eleanor played the part of the grieving but empowered woman perfectly, giving a brief rehearsed statement about new chapters and the necessity of moving on. They entered the courtroom, taking their seats on the right side of the aisle. The room was grand, with high ceilings and heavy oak paneling that seemed to amplify every whisper. They waited for Arthur, expecting him to shuffle in through the back doors, perhaps looking disheveled and worn down by the reality of his new impoverished life. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Halloway, peered over her spectacles at the empty defense table. She asked Julian if his client's husband intended to show up. Julian smirked, whispering to Eleanor that Arthur was likely too embarrassed to show his face, or perhaps couldn't afford the bus fare. He stood up and informed the judge that Mr. Sterling had been properly served, and that his absence should be taken as a final waiver of any further claims. But just as the judge reached for her gavel, a low, rhythmic thrumming sound began to vibrate through the floorboards of the courtroom. It started as a faint hum, like a distant swarm of bees, but quickly grew into a powerful, bone-shaking roar. The windows of the courthouse rattled in their frames. Outside, the reporters scrambled toward the windows and balconies pointing toward the sky. The sound was unmistakable, the heavy, expensive whine of high-performance jet engines. A shadow swept over the courthouse, momentarily plunging the room into darkness as something massive passed low overhead. The noise was so deafening that the proceedings came to a complete halt. Eleanor frowned, looking at Julian in confusion. "What is that? Construction!" she hissed. Julian shook his head, looking unsettled. That's not construction. That's a private aircraft, but no one is allowed to fly that low over the city center. The roar subsided into a duller, idling throb, indicating that the craft had landed nearby, likely at the private helipad just 2 blocks away that Arthur had helped fund years ago. A few minutes later, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They were swung wide by 2 men in dark professional suits who looked more like Secret Service agents than private security. The entire room went silent. The reporters who had squeezed into the back of the gallery held their breath. Walking through the doors was not a broken old man. It was Arthur Sterling, but he was transformed. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him with a military precision, his silver hair swept back, his posture as straight as a spear. He didn't look 74. He looked like a king returning to a kingdom that had forgotten his power. But it wasn't just his appearance that stopped their hearts. It was the man walking beside him. It was Marcus Thorne, the most feared corporate litigator in the Western Hemisphere. A man who didn't take divorce cases unless they involved billions. Arthur walked down the center aisle, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't look at Eleanor's shocked expression or his children's gaping mouths. He took his seat at the defense table, and Marcus Thorne placed a single, slim briefcase on the table. The judge, visibly surprised by Thorne's presence, regained her composure and asked for an explanation. "Mr. Thorne, I was under the impression this matter was settled, and that Mr. Sterling was representing himself following the divestment agreement." Thorne stood up, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "Your Honor, my client did indeed sign several documents under extreme duress and, as we will prove, based on fraudulent information provided by the plaintiffs. However, there is a small matter of the Sterling Global parent company, a shell entity that was never part of the marriage because it was established via a sovereign trust in the Cayman Islands 40 years ago. An entity that, as of 6 o'clock this morning, has exercised its right to reclaim all assets currently held by the Sterling Group due to a breach of fiduciary duty by its current board, namely Mrs. Sterling and her associates." Eleanor's face went pale. The Sterling Group was the company she had just spent weeks seizing. "What is he talking about?" she whispered frantically to Julian. Julian was frantically flipping through his files, his hands starting to shake. He had checked every public record, every filing. He had never seen anything about a sovereign trust. Arthur finally turned his head. He looked at Eleanor, not with anger, but with a terrifying, calm pity. "You thought I gave you the keys to the kingdom, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You forgot that I'm the one who built the locks." The silence in the courtroom was so thick it felt suffocating. Eleanor's breath hitched as she stared at Marcus Thorne, the legal shark who had just turned her victory into a looming shadow. Julian, who only moments ago had been radiating arrogance, was now sweating through his expensive silk shirt. He scrambled to his feet, his voice cracking slightly. He argued that the documents were final, that Arthur had signed away his rights, and that this sovereign trust was nothing more than a desperate fabrication to delay the inevitable. But Marcus Thorne was not a man who made claims he couldn't back with a mountain of evidence. He opened the slim briefcase and pulled out a document embossed with a gold seal that predated his marriage to Eleanor by decades. He explained to the court that while Arthur had indeed signed over the domestic holdings known as the Sterling Group, those holdings were merely subsidiaries of an offshore parent company, Sterling Primeval. According to the original bylaws of that parent company, any attempt by a secondary party to seize control through malicious litigation or coercive domestic maneuvering triggered an automatic poison pill provision. Essentially, Arthur hadn't just given Eleanor the keys to the kingdom. He had given her the keys to a building that was rigged to return to its original owner, the moment she tried to change the locks. The courtroom erupted into a hushed frenzy of whispers. The reporters were typing furiously, their fingers flying over their keyboards. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a masterclass in corporate warfare, disguised as a family dispute. Eleanor turned her gaze to Arthur, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and budding terror. "You lied to me," she hissed, her voice low so the judge wouldn't hear. "You sat there for 15 years and never mentioned this." Arthur didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, the grace of a man who had regained his throne apparent in every movement. He told her, calmly, that in a marriage, trust is the foundation. He had trusted her with his life, his health, and his home. She was the one who had brought lawyers and a predatory lover into their bedroom, so he simply decided to let the business handle the business. Victor and Beatrice were no longer looking at their phones. Victor's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. He realized that if the Sterling Group was reclaimed by the parent company, his early inheritance, the money he had already begun to spend on a luxury penthouse in Miami would vanish. The liquid assets they thought they had secured were suddenly frozen by a court order Thorne had filed just minutes before entering the room. They were looking at a total financial blackout. Justice Holloway pounded her gavel, demanding order. She looked at the documents Thorne had presented, her expression unreadable. She noted that if these documents were indeed valid, and the trust was established 40 years ago, it existed long before the marriage and was protected by international maritime and corporate laws that superseded the local post-nuptial agreement. She ordered an immediate stay of the asset transfer and called for a recess so the court's experts could verify the authenticity of the Sterling primeval filings. As the judge exited to her chambers, the room exploded into chaos. Eleanor lunged toward the defense table, but Arthur's security team stepped forward, creating an impassable wall of dark wool and muscle. She screamed at him, calling him a manipulative old fossil and a traitor. She accused him of playing a game with her life. Arthur stood up slowly, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked at her, then at his children who were now standing frozen in the middle of the aisle. He didn't yell. He didn't mock her. He simply told her that he had spent decades building a legacy for a family he thought loved him. He had been willing to share everything until he realized they were only waiting for him to die so they could divide the spoils. He told Eleanor that she hadn't fallen in love with a man. She had fallen in love with a balance sheet, and it was only fair that she be left with exactly what she brought into the marriage: a sharp tongue and an empty heart. Arthur turned to Marcus Thorne and nodded. They began to walk toward the exit, ignoring the barrage of questions from the press. As they reached the doors, Arthur paused. He looked back at Julian, the young lawyer who had thought he was the smartest person in the room. He told Julian that he might want to check his own firm's retainer agreement because Sterling Primeval happened to be their largest silent shareholder, and as of 5 minutes ago, Julian was not only off the case, he was out of a job. The doors swung shut behind Arthur, leaving Eleanor and his children in the middle of a collapsing empire. But the true shock was yet to come. As they followed him out to the courthouse steps, hoping to catch him for a final confrontation or a plea for mercy, they saw the source of the roar that had shaken the windows earlier. Arthur wasn't headed for a cab or even a limousine. Waiting at the nearby private pad was a custom-designed, sleek VTOL jet, a marvel of modern engineering that cost more than the Hamptons estate Eleanor thought she had won. The crowd on the courthouse steps gasped as the sleek, carbon fiber aircraft shimmered under the New York sun. This wasn't just a private jet. It was a statement of absolute sovereignty. Arthur Sterling didn't look back as he climbed into the cabin, the doors sealing with a pressurized hiss that seemed to silence the screams of Eleanor and the frantic apologies of his children. As the engines began their high-pitched whine once more, the dust kicked up by the rotors forced the onlookers to shield their eyes. Within seconds, the man they thought they had ruined was ascending, leaving the chaos of the pavement far beneath him. Inside the jet, the interior was a sanctuary of cream leather and brushed gold. Arthur sat down, finally allowing a small sigh of exhaustion to escape his lips. Marcus Thorne sat across from him, opening a tablet that displayed a series of rapidly changing red and green bars. Thorne informed him that the freeze on the domestic accounts was holding and that the board of the Sterling Group had been officially notified of the leadership change. The vultures, as Arthur called them, were currently locked out of their own offices. Every keycard Eleanor had issued to her new friends had been deactivated, and every cent she thought she had secured was under the control of the Sovereign Trust. Back on the ground, Eleanor was a storm of fury and panic. She grabbed Julian by the lapels, shaking him and demanding to know how this was possible. Julian, however, was staring at his phone in horror. He had just received a notification that his law firm's partnership had been terminated effectively, immediately. The firm's senior partners weren't about to go down with a sinking ship, especially when that ship was being torpedoed by Arthur Sterling. Julian pulled away from Eleanor, his face pale, and told her that he was done. He couldn't help her anymore. He had to save himself. Eleanor watched her ally flee into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with Beatrice and Victor. Her stepchildren were looking at her with newfound hatred. Victor was the first to speak, his voice trembling with rage. He accused Eleanor of being the one who had bungled the negotiations. He claimed that if she hadn't been so greedy, if she hadn't pushed his father so far, they might have at least walked away with their trusts intact. Beatrice nodded, her eyes cold. They had been willing to betray their father for a guaranteed payout, but now that the payout was gone, they needed someone to blame. The family that had conspired together just a week ago was now tearing itself apart on the marble steps of the courthouse. They were a spectacle for the cameras. A fallen socialite and two spoiled heirs arguing over the remains of a fortune they no longer possessed. They didn't realize that the stipend Arthur had mentioned in the penthouse wasn't a suggestion. It was the only thing they would ever see. Arthur had structured the trust so that while they would never starve, they would never again taste the luxury they had tried to steal from him. As the jet leveled out at 10,000 feet, heading toward a private island in the Caribbean where Arthur's real headquarters were located, he looked out the window at the receding coastline. He thought about the 15 years he had given to Eleanor. He wondered at what point the love had turned into a calculation. He realized now that the signs had been there for a long time, the subtle questions about his will, the way she encouraged him to take rest while she took over more meetings. He had played the part of the aging husband perfectly, letting her think she was winning while he prepared his final move. Arthur's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from his private security team at the penthouse. They reported that Eleanor had arrived back at the building only to find the elevators restricted. Her personal belongings were already being packed into cardboard boxes and sent to a storage unit in New Jersey. She was currently screaming at the doorman, but the doorman had strict orders. The Sterling Tower no longer recognized her name. For Eleanor, the reality was finally sinking in. The Queen had been evicted from the castle she thought she had inherited. Arthur leaned back and closed his eyes. The battle was won, but the victory felt heavy. He wasn't a man who enjoyed cruelty, but he was a man who believed in justice. He had given his family every opportunity to be loyal, to show him that they cared for the man and not the empire. They had failed that test. Now, as the jet sped across the Atlantic, he began to draft a new plan, one that involved using the vast resources of Sterling Primeval for something other than just building wealth. He was 74, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was just getting started. The transition from the high-stakes courtroom to the silent, pressurized cabin of the VTOL jet was more than a physical journey for Arthur. It was a psychological liberation. While the city below was still buzzing with the scandal, Arthur was already looking toward the horizon. Beside him, Marcus Thorne was busy on a secure satellite link, coordinating with a team of forensic accountants in Zurich. The goal was simple: to sever every remaining tentacle the Sterling family had wrapped around the global empire. Arthur watched the clouds break, revealing the vast, indifferent blue of the Atlantic. He wasn't just retiring, he was disappearing into a life they couldn't even imagine. Meanwhile, back in the heart of Manhattan, the scene at the Sterling Tower had turned into a full-blown media circus. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by her designer luggage, which had been unceremoniously piled onto the pavement by the building's new security detail. The locks had been changed, the biometric scanners recalibrated, and her name had been scrubbed from the directory before she could even reach the lobby. She was a woman who had spent a decade cultivating an image of untouchable power, and now she was being filmed by tourists as she argued with a stone-faced security guard. Victor and Beatrice arrived shortly after, their own luxury vehicles having been repossessed by the leasing companies that Arthur's trust secretly controlled. They were forced to take a common rideshare to the tower, only to find their stepmother in a state of total breakdown. The alliance that had seemed so ironclad in the penthouse was now a toxic slurry of blame and regret. Victor looked at the mountain of boxes and realized that his life of leisure had ended in the span of a single afternoon. He didn't have a job, he didn't have a degree that mattered, and he certainly didn't have his father's favor anymore. The realization began to dawn on them. Arthur hadn't just taken the money, he had taken the infrastructure of their lives. The credit cards were declined at the first cafe they tried to enter to escape the cameras. The private health insurance policies were flagged for cancellation. Even the cell phone plans, registered under a corporate umbrella, were slated for deactivation at midnight. They were being systematically erased from the world of the elite. Eleanor sat on one of her Louis Vuitton trunks, her face a mask of smudged mascara and cold fury. She realized that Arthur hadn't been slowing down for the last 3 years. He had been building a fortress. In his study aboard the jet, Arthur reviewed a file labeled Project Phoenix. It was a philanthropic initiative he had been planning in secret. A network of vocational schools and medical clinics aimed at revitalizing the neighborhoods where he had started his first business. He had originally intended to involve Beatrice and Victor, hoping to teach them the value of service. Now he decided to launch it alone, using the very funds they had tried to steal, to build something that would actually outlast his name. He felt a strange sense of peace. The burden of maintaining a facade for an ungrateful family had been lifted. As the sun began to set, casting a long amber glow over the ocean, Arthur's thoughts drifted back to the early days of his marriage to Eleanor. He remembered the way she had looked at him with what he thought was admiration. He wondered when that admiration had curdled into the cold calculation he saw in the courtroom. He realized that wealth has a way of magnifying the flaws in a person's soul. Eleanor hadn't changed. She had simply become more of who she always was. He had been the one who refused to see it, blinded by the hope that he could buy the family he never had as a child. Thorne interrupted his reflections with a brief update. The New York Supreme Court has granted the preliminary injunction, Arthur. The Sterling Group is officially under the management of the Sovereign Trust's appointed board. Eleanor's lawyers are already filing appeals, but they're doing it on contingency now. None of the major firms will touch her since Julian's firm was liquidated. Arthur nodded. He knew the legal battle would drag on for years in the lower courts, but it didn't matter. He had the resources to fight forever. She didn't have the resources to survive the month. The jet began its descent toward a private airstrip on a secluded island in the Exumas. This was Arthur's true sanctuary, a place Eleanor didn't even know existed. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac, Arthur felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt in a decade. He wasn't an old man waiting for the end. He was a man who had reclaimed his life from the vultures. He stepped out into the warm tropical air, the scent of salt and jasmine, a welcome change from the stale air of the courtroom. The world thought he had gone away to die, but Arthur Sterling was just getting his second wind. The transition from a life of extreme luxury to the cold reality of the common world was a shock Eleanor and the children were not prepared for. While Arthur was breathing in the fresh air of his private island, Eleanor was standing in a budget hotel lobby in Long Island City, her credit card having been declined at 3 different 5-star establishments in Manhattan. The name Sterling no longer acted as a skeleton key to the city's most exclusive doors. Instead, it had become a red flag. The hotel clerk looked at her with a mixture of pity and recognition. He had seen her face on the morning news. Beatrice and Victor were no better off. They had retreated to a small apartment owned by one of Victor's few remaining friends, a man who was only helping because he hoped to eventually get a lead on where the hidden money was. The siblings sat in a cramped living room that smelled of stale pizza and cheap cologne, a far cry from the vaulted ceilings and lavender-scented hallways of their father's estate. The realization was sinking in. Their father hadn't just cut them off. He had performed a surgical extraction of their social status. Back at the island headquarters, Arthur was deep in consultation with his new board of directors. These weren't the yes men that Eleanor had surrounded herself with. These were veterans of industry, people Arthur had known for 40 years, men and women who valued loyalty and long-term vision over quarterly profits. Arthur instructed them to begin the audit of the Sterling Group's domestic operations. He knew Eleanor had been skimming, but the depth of the corruption was staggering. She hadn't just been living a lavish lifestyle. She had been funneling money into offshore accounts managed by Julian's shell companies. Arthur realized that the betrayal went deeper than just a divorce. It was a coordinated effort to bankrupt his legacy while he was still alive to witness it. He felt a cold, sharp clarity. He told Marcus Thorne to move from defense to offense. He didn't just want his assets back. He wanted a full accounting of every dollar stolen. He authorized the filing of civil racketeering charges against Julian and a series of John Doe defendants, the various associates who had helped Eleanor hide the money. The vultures were about to find out that the lion wasn't just awake. He was hunting. In the midst of this corporate warfare, Arthur took a moment to walk down to the beach. The turquoise water lapped at his feet, and for the first time in years, his chest didn't feel tight with the weight of expectations. He thought about the small suitcase he had carried out of the penthouse. It didn't contain gold or documents. It contained a few photographs of his first wife, the woman who had helped him build the foundation of his life before she passed away 20 years ago. He realized that in his pursuit of growth and his desire to provide for his children, he had lost sight of the values they had started with. He had tried to replace love with trust funds, and the result was the monsters currently hiding in a Long Island hotel. He sat on a piece of driftwood and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. He wasn't just protecting his money anymore. He was protecting the memory of the man he used to be. He decided that the Project Phoenix initiative wouldn't just be a side project. It would be his main focus. He would dismantle the Sterling Group as it existed and rebuild it as a massive charitable foundation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The more Eleanor fought for the money, the more of it he would give away to people who actually deserved it. Meanwhile, Eleanor was not going down without a fight. She spent her last few $1,000s in cash to hire a private investigator. She didn't care about the divorce anymore. She wanted to know where that jet went. She was convinced that if she could find Arthur's hidden island, she could find a way to claim it as part of the marital estate. She was fueled by a toxic mix of desperation and the delusion that she was still the one in control. She sat in the dark hotel room staring at a map of the Caribbean, unaware that every move she made was being tracked by the very security firm she thought she was hiding from. The legal battle was about to enter its most brutal phase. Marcus Thorne had prepared a Trojan horse filing, a document that appeared to offer a settlement but actually contained a series of admissions that, if signed, would lead Eleanor and Julian straight into a federal investigation for tax evasion. Arthur watched the sunset from his terrace, sipping a glass of water, his mind as sharp as a razor. He knew Eleanor would take the bait. Her greed was the one thing he could always count on. The trap was set, and as Arthur expected, Eleanor's desperation made her reckless. In her cramped hotel room, she received the settlement offer, from Marcus Thorne's office. To her untrained eye, it looked like a white flag. The document proposed a lump sum payment of $5 million and the title to a villa in France, provided she signed a full release of all future claims against the Sterling Sovereign Trust. To Eleanor, $5 million was a fraction of what she wanted, but it was a lifeline that would get her out of the stench of a budget motel and back into the life she craved. Julian, now working out of a coffee shop with a burner phone, cautioned her to wait. He sensed the underlying complexity, but Eleanor was done waiting. She was tired of the whispers, the stares, and the cold reality of being nobody. She signed the papers with a flourish of her gold pen, the only expensive thing she had managed to keep. She thought she was securing her future. In reality, she was signing an admission of unreported secondary income that the trust had meticulously documented over the last 5 years. By accepting the settlement, she was legally acknowledging the existence of the very accounts she had used to hide the money she stole from Arthur. On the island, Arthur received the notification of the signature. He didn't celebrate. There was no joy in seeing the woman he once loved walk into a cage of her own making. He turned his attention to Victor and Beatrice. They had reached out to him through an old family friend, pleading for a meeting. They claimed they were misled by Eleanor, and that they were victims of her manipulation. Arthur agreed to meet them, but not in New York, and certainly not on his island. He directed them to a small, dusty office in a commercial district of New Jersey, the birthplace of his very first logistics company. When the siblings arrived, they found the office barely furnished. There were no leather chairs, no mahogany desks, and no assistants serving espresso. There was only Arthur sitting on a metal folding chair, looking at a ledger. Victor began a rehearsed apology, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. Beatrice tried to squeeze out a tear, talking about how much she missed their family dinners. Arthur let them speak for 10 minutes, his face an unreadable mask. When they finally ran out of excuses, he stood up. He didn't give them a lecture on morality. He gave them a choice. He had established 2 entry-level positions at a shipping port in Savannah, Georgia. They would be working on the docks, learning the business from the bottom up, just as he had done 50 years ago. Their salaries would be modest, enough for a small apartment and a used car. If they stayed for 3 years, worked hard, and showed genuine character, their trusts would be reinstated. If they refused, they would be permanently disinherited, and the money would be diverted to the Project Phoenix Scholarship Fund. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor looked at his manicured hands, horrified at the thought of manual labor. Beatrice looked at the dusty office, as if it were a prison cell. They realized that their father wasn't offering them a way back into his world. He was offering them a way to earn their way into it. To them, it was an insult. Victor turned and walked out without a word. Beatrice stayed for a moment, her eyes darting between her father and the door, before she too followed her brother into the afternoon heat. They chose the pride of the penniless over the humility of the hard-working. Arthur watched them go from the window. He felt a profound sense of closure. He had given them the map to redemption, and they had thrown it away. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Thorne. "It's over, Marcus. File the documents with the IRS and the district attorney. Whatever happens next is their own doing." As he walked out of the office, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying for decades. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a free man. The final phase of Arthur's plan was moving into motion. He wasn't just hiding away. He was preparing for a public return that would redefine his legacy. While Eleanor was busy planning her comeback with the settlement money she hadn't yet received, the authorities were already reviewing the evidence Thorne had provided. The Sterling downfall was about to become the Sterling justice, and the world was going to have a front-row seat to the most sophisticated takedown in the history of Manhattan's elite. The net was tightening around Eleanor and Julian, but they were too blinded by their own hubris to feel the mesh closing in. While Eleanor spent her days at a high-end hotel, convinced that the $5 million settlement would be the seed for her new empire, Julian was busy trying to move his remaining ghost assets into a new offshore shell. They had no idea that every transaction they attempted was being monitored by a high-level cybersecurity firm, retained by Arthur Sterling. The private jet that had roared over the courthouse was just the visible tip of an iceberg of technological and financial surveillance. In the quiet of his Caribbean retreat, Arthur watched the digital readouts of his former wife's activities. He felt a strange detachment, like a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. He had spent years trying to satisfy a hunger in Eleanor that was bottomless. Now, watching her scramble for the remnants of his fortune, he realized that the greatest punishment he could give her was not poverty, but the realization of her own insignificance. Without his name and his resources, she was merely a woman with expensive tastes and no means to sustain them. The hammer fell on a Tuesday morning, as Eleanor was finishing a luxury brunch at a rooftop restaurant, paid for with a credit card she believed was now backed by the settlement. Two men in dark suits approached her table. They weren't Arthur's security. They were federal agents. They presented her with a warrant for her arrest on charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The settlement she had signed was the primary evidence, a confession of income she had never declared. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the patrons of the restaurant, people she had desperately tried to impress for years, pulled out their phones to record her disgrace. Simultaneously, Julian was intercepted at a small private airfield in Teterboro. He had been planning to fly to a non-extradition country, his bags packed with cash and encrypted hard drives. He didn't even make it to the hangar. He was tackled by a tactical team just as he stepped out of his car. The young lawyer, who had thought he could outmaneuver a man who had built a global logistics network, was now facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The easy heist had become a life sentence. The news broke across every major network within the hour. The headlines shifted from Sterling's downfall to the Sterling sting. The media, once eager to mock the aging tycoon, now praised his legendary strategic brilliance. The public was captivated by the story of the man who had played the role of the victim so perfectly that his enemies had walked straight into their own funeral. But Arthur wasn't watching the news. He was in a warehouse in Georgia, the same one he had offered to his children. He stood on the loading dock, watching the rhythmic flow of containers being moved by massive cranes. He was surrounded by the sounds of industry, the very sounds that had built his life. He looked at his watch, then at a young man working near the conveyors. It wasn't Victor. His son had never shown up. Neither had Beatrice. They had chosen to disappear into the fading shadows of the European social scene, living off what little they could scavenge from their former lives. Arthur felt a pang of sadness, but no regret. He had offered them the truth, and they had preferred the lie. Arthur turned to Marcus Thorne, who was standing nearby. "It's time for the final phase," Arthur said. "I want the Sterling Tower sold. Every penny of the proceeds is to go to the Phoenix Foundation. I don't want a single brick left of the life I built with Eleanor. We're starting over, Marcus. Truly starting over." Thorne nodded, making a note on his tablet. The empire wasn't being destroyed. It was being transformed into something that actually served the world. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic, Arthur boarded his VTOL jet once more. This time, he wasn't heading to a hidden island or a secret office. He was heading to a small town in the Midwest, where a new vocational school was being dedicated in his name. He was no longer a man defined by what he possessed, but by what he was giving back. The jet roared into the sky, its engines a defiant shout against the silence of his past. The Titan hadn't fallen. He had simply ascended to a height where the vultures could no longer reach him. The transition from corporate predator to public benefactor was not merely a change in title for Arthur Sterling. It was a complete spiritual overhaul. As the legal proceedings against Eleanor and Julian dominated the airwaves, Arthur remained a ghost in the headlines. focusing his energy on the ground level of his new mission. He spent his days in the heart of the Midwest, walking through the skeletons of new buildings that would soon house the Sterling Vocational Institutes. He wore denim and work boots, moving among the carpenters and electricians, not as a boss, but as a man who understood the value of a day's labor. The contrast was stark. While Eleanor sat in a stark, fluorescent-lit holding cell, awaiting her bail hearing, which was denied due to being a high-flight risk, Arthur was breathing in the scent of fresh sawdust and hot asphalt. The news reached him that Beatrice and Victor had reached out to the media, attempting to sell a tell-all story about their father's cruel and unusual demands. However, the public's appetite for their privileged whining had vanished. The world saw them for what they were: two able-bodied adults who had been offered a path to redemption and had turned their noses up at it. No one wanted to buy their story. They were becoming irrelevant, fading into the background noise of the city they once thought they owned. Inside the federal facility, Eleanor's reality was crumbling. The luxury creams and silk robes were replaced by rough cotton and industrial soap. She was no longer the queen of the Sterling Empire. She was inmate number 77, 1419. Julian, housed in a separate wing, was already attempting to strike a deal with the prosecution, offering to testify against Eleanor in exchange for a reduced sentence. The betrayal she had orchestrated against Arthur was now being mirrored by the man she had chosen to replace him. It was a poetic, if brutal, irony. Eleanor realized, far too late, that the loyalty she had demanded from Arthur was something she had never truly possessed herself. Arthur, meanwhile, was sitting in a small diner on the outskirts of the construction site, sharing a meal with the foreman. For the first time in decades, he wasn't checking a stock ticker or worrying about a hostile takeover. He felt a profound sense of lightness. He had realized that the private jet entrance at the courthouse wasn't just about showing off his wealth. It was his final farewell to that version of himself. He had used the tools of the Titan to dismantle the life of the Titan. He was now a man of the people, using his remaining years to ensure that others had the opportunities he had fought so hard to protect. The Sterling Tower in Manhattan was officially sold to a green energy conglomerate. The day the Sterling sign was dismantled from the top of the building, a crowd gathered to watch. It marked the end of an era. The proceeds, totaling nearly $1 billion after taxes and fees, were immediately transferred to the Phoenix Foundation. Arthur watched the footage on a small television in his modest rental house. He didn't feel a sting of loss. He felt a surge of pride. That building had become a monument to greed and betrayal. Now, its value would fund the futures of thousands of young students across the country. Marcus Thorne arrived that evening with the final reports. "The domestic accounts are settled, Arthur. The trust has been fully reorganized as a non-profit entity. Eleanor's appeals have been exhausted, and Julian has officially turned state's evidence. They're looking at 15 to 20 years each." Arthur nodded slowly. He asked about his children. Thorne sighed and informed him that Victor had been spotted in a casino in Monaco, likely blowing the last of his hidden cash, while Beatrice was attempting to launch a luxury lifestyle blog that had yet to gain a single follower. They were still chasing the shadow of the fortune. Arthur looked out of the window at the quiet street. He told Thorne that he wanted to set up one final provision, a safety net that would trigger only if his children ever completed a full year of honest work or checked into a rehabilitation program for their various vices. He couldn't stop being a father, even if they had stopped being his children. Thorne made the note, moved by the old man's capacity for a quiet, distant mercy. Arthur was done with the drama, done with the revenge. He was ready for the peace that comes after the storm has finally spent its fury. As the night settled over the plains, Arthur sat on his porch, listening to the crickets. He thought about the day at the courthouse, the shock on their faces, the roar of the engines, the feeling of the wind as he ascended. It had been a necessary theatricality, or a way to close a chapter with a definitive bang. But the silence of the Midwest was much sweeter. He was 74, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't running toward a goal or away from a ghost. He was simply where he was meant to be. The legal dust had finally settled over the concrete jungle of New York, but the echoes of Arthur Sterling's final move continued to ripple through the world of the elite. Eleanor was sentenced to 18 years in a federal correctional facility. The woman who once refused to wear the same diamond necklace twice was now adjusting to a life of strict schedules and communal living. Julian, the man who thought he could play the puppet master, received 12 years after his plea deal. His legal career not just ended, but scorched from the earth. They had sought to leave Arthur with nothing, yet they were the ones who had become ghosts in their own lives. Arthur, however, was far from a ghost. The Sterling Vocational Institute opened its doors to its first class of 500 students in the heart of the Midwest. On opening day, there were no red carpets or champagne towers. Instead, Arthur stood at the gates in a simple flannel shirt, shaking the hands of young men and women who finally had a chance at a career. He wasn't the titan of logistics anymore. He was simply Arthur, the man who made it possible. He had traded a penthouse for a purpose, and in the eyes of these students, he was far wealthier than he had ever been when he sat atop Sterling Tower. Victor and Beatrice eventually faded from the public eye entirely. Without the constant fuel of their father's fortune, their glamorous lives evaporated. Rumors placed Victor working as a promoter for a failing nightclub in Ibiza, while Beatrice was said to be living in a small flat in London, finally forced to take a job as a junior assistant at a gallery, the very kind of person she used to treat as invisible. Arthur's safety net remained in place, a silent guardian waiting for the day they might finally choose character over currency. He hoped, for their sake, that day would come before his time was up. In his final years, Arthur lived in a modest house overlooking the campus of his flagship school. He spent his mornings in the library and his afternoons mentoring students who had the same hunger he'd had as a boy in Brooklyn. He had realized that true legacy isn't written in bank statements or carved into the sides of skyscrapers. It's built into the lives of the people you lift up. The man who lost everything in a divorce had actually gained the only thing worth keeping: a life defined by integrity rather than an estate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur looked up as a small private plane crossed the sky. He smiled, thinking of the day he arrived at the courthouse in his VTOL jet, shocking the world. It had been a grand performance, a necessary display of power to protect his soul. But as the plane disappeared into the clouds, he turned back to his books, content in the silence. He had arrived at the court as a man they thought was finished, but he left it as a man who was finally, truly free. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey of justice and redemption here on Dr. Harmony. This story serves as a powerful reminder that while money can buy many things, it can never purchase a clean conscience or true loyalty. Arthur Sterling showed us that the best way to handle a betrayal is to rise so high that the vultures can no longer reach you. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more deep dives into the dramas of the elite and the triumphs of the human spirit, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Your support allows us to keep bringing these gripping tales to life. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below. Do you think Arthur was too hard on his children, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Until next time, stay grounded and keep seeking the truth. This is Dr. Harmony signing off.